So the United States has increased its influence in different parts of the world, particularly Cuba and the Philippines. So the United States ideas, methods, their way of doing business has really begun to expand. Now, when Theodore Roosevelt took office in 1901, remember Theodore Roosevelt has resigned as Secretary of the Navy. He has formed his own um, little contingent of the military called the Rough Riders. He is a very, in there involved leader. Now, when he takes office in 1901, his philosophy on the presidency included protecting American commercial and strategic interests with force. And he believed that the United States, in order to be able to protect its interests, needed to have a very strong military. Roosevelt, along with Alfred Thayer Mann, embraced the idea of the United States as a major world power and wanted to kind of keep the United States in this position as a sort of global police force and peacekeeper. Roosevelt hoped that the United States might increase its influence in the Caribbean as well as in Central and South America, and emphasized the building of a canal across Central America as being key to this mission. In 1901, the United States and Britain signed a treaty, and this treaty gives the United States the right to construct a canal, which Roosevelt believed should be situated in Panama, a site that was partially completed by the French before they had sold it to the United States for $40 million. Now, the United States needed the support of Colombia, which controlled Panama, in order to complete this canal. But the negotiations hit a snag when the government refused to ratify a treaty with Secretary of State Hay. Now, Roosevelt argued that the completion of the canal was necessary to keep the international markets functioning, and in 1903 he sent warships to Panama City in support of an insurrection against Colombian rule. Now, Roosevelt quickly realized that Panamanian independence, and he signed a treaty with the new government. The United States then had the right to build the canal and control the canal. The Panama Canal opened in 1914. Now, if you're wondering why this Panama Canal was so important and such a coveted piece of land for the United States. If you're looking at this world map here, you can see North America up here and South America. Now, before the Panama Canal, which is right here, in order the for goods and products to be moved, they would need to go all the way around this particular territory to get to the various locations, which is about 8,000 more miles total. But with this Panama Canal, we are able to move goods, whatever, through kind of this very small territory right here. Now, the Panama Canal is pretty interesting. So I want to show you here. Basically, the way it works is that the water would be allowed to raise the ships, and so they would move across the canal. And it's this intricate interlocking system where the walls will open and allow the ships to move across the territory there through that canal. And it takes a little bit of time, but it's not a certainly not a long process, and certainly much more quick and efficient than an extra 8,000 miles of sailing around the territory. So with this purchase of the Panama Canal, the United States now has significant control and influence in Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Panama Canal, and of course the Philippines. And the United States, really, with Puerto Rico, Panama Canal, and Cuba, has increased their strength in this Caribbean area significantly. Roosevelt believed that this strength supported his big stick diplomatic philosophy of brandishing U.S. authority to deter any European powers from attempting to intervene in the region. Remember, Roosevelt believes in governing, leading in a way that says we will have the biggest military and we will be the most powerful nation. That way, no other nation will attempt to undermine our authority. In 1904, Roosevelt reaffirmed the U.S. position when the Dominican Republic threatened to default on European loans that would total $22 million. Roosevelt actually added his own corollary to the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, which stated that the United States would not allow any intervention in the Western Hemisphere by outside powers. Now, this Monroe Doctrine from 1823 has been around for a while, and the idea is that, anything that undermines the United States influence here in the West at this particular time in 1823, we won't allow that. Now, Roosevelt kind of extends that, and he expands that with this Roosevelt corollary. And with this, Roosevelt proclaimed that the United States had the right to step in to prevent any, quote, chronic wrongdoing, end quote, in the internal affairs of any nation in Latin America and the Caribbean. So Roosevelt basically says because the United States is so heavily invested in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and this Panama area, that they have an obligation to step in when any other part of Latin America or the Caribbean is being threatened. The Roosevelt corollary reaffirmed the policies that Roosevelt had enacted in Panama and Cuba and confirmed that the United States saw Central America and the Caribbean as part of its sphere of influence. Roosevelt also expressed a strong interest in Asia and sought to ensure that the United States maintained a, quote, open door policy in China. The idea was to help American businesses to make inroads alongside European businesses. The United States became involved in suppressing a nationalist rebellion in China called the Boxer Uprising that arose in response to foreign investments. In doing so, the United States earned a place in Chinese trade with European competitors. Now, remember, the word rebellion just means the group that's rising up against the group in power. Now, the United States supported rebellion in Cuba. It supported rebellion in the Philippines, but it doesn't support rebellion in China. The United States further involved itself in Asian affairs in 1904 after Russia invaded Manchuria, which triggered a Japanese attack on the Russian fleet. Fearing that Japan could make serious inroads into China, Roosevelt organized a conference to negotiate peace between Russia and Japan that would leave the door to China open to the United States. Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, embraced some of Roosevelt's diplomacy, but he emphasized the role of business in foreign affairs through a policy of what he called dollar diplomacy. So Taft doesn't buy into Roosevelt's big stick idea. He believes in what he calls dollar diplomacy. By encouraging bankers to invest in the Caribbean and Central America, Taft believed that he was substituting dollars for bullets, and that this would spread American influence through commerce. So again, Taft believes that rather than being a force that might use military might to quash rebellion, and spread influence, that the United States should sort of buy influence around the world. Taft's policy was unsuccessful, as he discovered that dollars were an inadequate substitute for bullets. In nearly every instance of dollar diplomacy, Taft also found that he needed to send a military presence to protect American businesses overseas. Now, Taft sort of has a short presidency and not a lot of excitement. When Woodrow Wilson takes office in 1913, his goal was to distinguish policies and philosophies that were different from Roosevelt and Taft by not promoting a military policy or a dollar policy, but a moral approach to diplomacy. But he also found out that exercising U.S. power and authority was essential to maintaining American influence in the Caribbean and in Latin America. Mexico experienced a revolution in 1911 that sparked a civil war. Woodrow Wilson responded by pursuing strategies to protect American oil interests in Mexico and pushing Mexicans to promote leaders who the United States believed to be good men. Now, on April 22, 1914, after Wilson had withdrawn U.S. diplomatic recognition from Mexico, he sent the U.S. Navy to Veracruz, where a battle resulted in the deaths of 19 Americans and 126 Mexicans. This heightened the tensions between these two nations. Wilson was very inconsistent in his alliances with Mexican leadership, supporting, then rejecting the leadership of Pancho Villa, which promoted Pancho Villa to attack Columbus, New Mexico. Wilson responded by sending General John Pershing into Mexico to capture Villa. This deepened the divide between the United States and Mexico. The operation, which began in July of 1916, was a failure. And in January of 1917, Wilson withdrew Pershing and his troops from Mexico. The withdrawal of troops from Mexico was in part a response to this escalating situation in Europe. Now, way back on June 28th in 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, which triggered a war between the Central Powers being Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary. The Allies, Great Britain, France, and Russia, who were later joined by Italy in 1915. So while Wilson is trying to deal with the situation in Mexico, which is literally next door to the United States, things are becoming very volatile in Europe. The beginning of the First World War actually starts with that assassination of the Archduke in 1914, but the United States does not become involved in the war until 3 years later. The United States, though concerned about the consequences of British defeat, really does attempt to remain neutral. They stay out of the war, and this really becomes a rallying cry for women, for suffragists in 1915 when they form the Women's Peace Party. In spite of its neutrality, the United States had strong ties with the Allied powers and recognized that it had a significant economic stake in the war. In 1915, Wilson authorized private loans to the Allied nations. Now, it's important to understand that most people in the United States really are not advocating, at least not in 1915, that the United States become involved in this conflict in Europe. Women in particular are advocating for peace and staying out of the war. And Wilson, at least publicly, is saying the same thing. But Wilson, members of Congress recognize that if their their allies, Great Britain and France, are defeated by these other nations, that will have a negative impact on U.S. markets and U.S. economy. So as a result, they begin to authorize these private loans to help the allied nations to be able to fight effectively. Now, Britain attempted to starve Germany by establishing a blockade in the North Sea, and this really violates international law. Now, Wilson recognizes this. He recognizes that Great Britain is in violation of international law, but he really doesn't say very much. He just kind of says, "Now that's not nice," and offers a very weak protest. Now, in order for Germany to combat this strategy that the British are using, they use their newly developed U-boats, which are submarines, to ambush the British ships. And it really served as kind of a warning to any neutral nations that if they didn't want their ships to be sank, that they should keep their ships out of any British waterway. Because from underneath the ocean, from a submarine, you can't tell which ship is a British ship, which ship is an American ship, or some other country. So when the Germans begin to engage in this U-boat warfare, it's really a kind of um, a stare down to other nations. Now, the British created more strife between the two nations because what they decided to do was any country that was neutral, right? They would fly that country's flag on their ship. So they were saying, even though the Americans say they're neutral, we're going to fly their flags on our ships. And then there was also this problem of armed merchant ships. So these are merchant ships that really only are bringing goods and products, but they were armed. And so what we now see is that it's really not easy to tell who an enemy is. And if a ship is flying a lot of different flags from a lot of different countries, it's really difficult to know if that person is friend or foe. On May 15th, 1915, the British and Germany strategies led to an event that had dire consequences on U.S. neutrality. German U-boats attacked the British cruise ship, the Lusitania, killing 1,198 people. 128 were Americans. Now, Wilson really clings to this idea of neutrality in spite of the fact that the public sentiment shifts with this sinking of the Lusitania. Many Americans begin to say this is not okay. Americans have now been killed, and we have a responsibility to become involved. Germany and the United States kind of negotiate, and from this negotiation, Germany is barred from attacking any other passenger ships, and they are required to give money to the Lusitania survivors. Now, at the same time, Americans do continue to travel on ships owned by nations at war, and this heightens the chance of any kind of any future engagement with the United States because more and more Americans are traveling on these ships. Additionally, and importantly, there is evidence that suggests that the Lusitania, although a passenger ship, was moving weapons and supplies to aid the British. In 1916, Wilson's policies both embraced neutrality and reflected a growing interest in expressing American power. Wilson increased the size of the Army, the Navy, and the National Guard when he signed the National Defense Act. But he ran a re-election campaign on the slogan, quote, "Keep us out of war," end quote, which highlighted his efforts to maintain U.S. neutrality. So Wilson is really in a difficult place because he recognizes that this war, the Great War as it was called, is really not showing any signs of ending soon. And it, for a variety of reasons, is becoming something that is impacting more and more Americans. It's impacting business, it's impacting vacation, it's impacting everything. And so he kind of adopts some of that Roosevelt idea of increasing defense spending. But at the same time, he really wants to keep the United States out of this conflict. Now, Wilson runs against a guy named Charles Evans Hughes, and Hughes was as inconsistent as Wilson was about whether or not the United States should be involved in the war or if the United States should continue to try to be neutral and promote peace. At the end of the day, there's just a lot of misinformation in terms and decisiveness about policies. And so Wilson is re-elected as President of the United States of America. As the conflict in Europe continues to become more volatile in 1917, the United States really hoped to be able to bring both sides together to negotiate what the United States called, quote, "peace without victory," end quote. And this would be based on this idea of self-determination, freedom, international law, and an end to international entanglements that would foster conflict. Now, I want to zero in just a moment on this concept of self-determination. It's that nations should be able to be independent, decide what's best for themselves, be self-sufficient, um, all the things that the United States believes that it is. Now, the Germans were really not interested in Wilson's plan and determined instead that they would ratchet up their offensive forces in the belief that they could win the war before the United States would even engage its military. So Germany says, no, we're not playing this game. We want to be victorious, and we just need to attack quickly and defeat the British. On February 1st, Germany stated publicly, so they put this out, that they would attack any ship that attempted to bypass its blockade of Great Britain. And Wilson responded by arming merchant ships. Now, Germany, to their credit, says, hey guys, if you send a ship past our blockade to Great Britain for whatever reason, you're bringing guns, you're bringing supplies, you're bringing soldiers, you're bringing people on vacation, we will kill them. We will sink this ship. And so Wilson responds to that by arming all merchant ships. So these are ships that are bringing goods and supplies and products to be sold. Wilson responds by basically making them military ships. On February 24th, so this is just a few weeks later, the British intercepted a telegram to the Mexican government from Arthur Zimmerman, who was the German foreign minister, in which he offered Mexico an alliance against the United States and promised to return Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to Mexico if Mexico would support the Central Powers and the Central Powers were victorious. Now, remember, the United States has been involved in these conflicts in Mexico in 1912 and 1913. So the United States has a tumultuous relationship with Mexico. Now, when the U.S. newspapers revealed the content of the telegram to the public, pro-war sentiment spikes in the United States. Americans say this is unacceptable, that we would lose Texas, that we would lose New Mexico and Arizona to Mexico, and so they begin to support U.S. involvement. Following several U-boat attacks on American ships, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war on Germany and the Central Powers. And on April 2nd, 1917, after 4 days of debate, Congress approved the resolution, and the United States joined the fight, but they were not considered an ally. They were considered an associated power. So even though the United States is becoming involved in what was called the Great War, they still don't want to be equally involved. Wilson promoted the decision to go to war as a moral decision, arguing that the United States would be instrumental in forging global peace and making the world, quote, safe for democracy, end quote. In 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, creating the draft to increase the size of the Army. Though American troops had little impact on the war before 1918, the U.S. Navy quickly joined the fight, working with the British to undermine German U-boat warfare. In November of 1917, the Russian Revolution installed a communist regime in Russia. Remember, Russia is an ally. The communist regime installed in Russia negotiated a separate peace with the Central Powers, which weakened the Allied cause. But shortly thereafter, the United States troops arrived in Europe and bolstered the Allies' efforts. General John Pershing, you may remember him from the Philippines, led 1 million troops from May through September in 1918. The defensive strategies designed to push the Germans back from northern France and Belgium. The United States lost close to 50,000 troops and saw more than 230,000 injured. The conflict highlighted the new patterns of war technologies, including the development of the machine gun, heavy artillery, flamethrowers, and poison gas shells. The American forces proved to be a significant boon to the Allies, and on November 11th, 1918, Germany surrendered, effectively ending the war. Now, while the war is going on, while the men who have volunteered or been drafted are in Europe fighting, at home there is an effort to help promote success. To promote the U.S. war effort, the Wilson administration mobilized progressive forces on the domestic front in 1917. They established the War Industries Board, which managed industries and the economy under the leadership of Wall Street financier Bernard Baruch. Now, As businesses united with the government, organized labor saw some positive consequences from the outbreak of war. Remember, organized labor, unions, these efforts of poor people to advocate for rights has been largely ignored by the federal government. However, once the war begins and this War Industries Board gets involved, they begin to sort of manage companies, businesses, industries to ensure that they are running efficiently and turning out adequate supplies. After a series of strikes in 1917, Wilson created the National War Labor Board, which was a collaboration between the unions, the corporation, and the public. And with this comes, finally, the 8-hour workday, the ability to collectively bargain, equal pay for women, and overtime pay. And the agreement from the workers was that they would not strike because we needed as a nation to ensure that industries were running so that the war effort would be aided. The war increased employment among women and offered them new opportunities to work as operators, nurses, and clerical workers, as well as the opportunity to work in more masculine positions such as welding, oiling railroad engines, driving streetcars, and operating drill presses. The war changed many aspects of daily life, including how Americans ate. Wilson established the Food Administration, which was headed by Herbert Hoover, who urged Americans to embrace wheatless Mondays, meatless Tuesdays, and porkless Thursdays and Saturdays. The idea was that by decreasing the amount of food that those on the home front consumed, there would be more foods to send to those fighting on the war front. The establishment of the Fuel Administration also encouraged Americans to limit their consumption, suggesting that Americans take fuel holidays voluntarily. The agency also created daylight saving time, which conserved fuel by adding an hour of sunlight to the end of the workday. The Railroad Administration offered other methods to support the war effort. Specifically, they took a more forceful approach by coordinating train schedules and by regulating ticket prices. They also began to upgrade their tracks and increase workers' pay. Even after the war declaration, many Americans were still not in support of the entry into the war. Wilson responded by creating a Committee on Public Information, which was headed by George Creel. The purpose of the Committee on Public Information was to disseminate war propaganda and stimulate patriotic fervor. The agency urged war reporters to limit coverage of gruesome affairs, produced films and posters that vilified the enemy, and highlighted the United States' moral cause in the war, which was the promotion of democracy. The rhetoric of the war encouraged groups like the NAACP to push Wilson to promote racial equality at home, particularly at a time when African American soldiers were fighting overseas for a distinctly American cause. In spite of government efforts to win support from the public through propaganda, many Americans remained wary of war. Promoting the government to pass the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which prohibited anti-war protest and punished acts of disloyalty, respectively. So the Espionage Act in 1918 prohibits any anti-war protest. It is illegal to disagree with the war, to speak out against that, to publish anything that would not be in support of the war effort. And then the Sedition Act in 1918 punishes any type of act of disloyalty, which might be speaking out against the government or the war effort. Among the 2,000 people that were persecuted and prosecuted under these laws was, you guessed it, Eugene Debs of the Socialist Party, who in 1918 had told a crowd that the draft was a form of slavery. He was sentenced to 10 years under the Espionage Act, but he was pardoned by President Warren G. Harding in 1921. Americans also embraced the notion of 100% Americanism. Forms of German cultural expression were banned. The names of German foods were changed. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage, and hamburgers became Liberty sandwiches. And this is actually very similar to what we saw after 9/11, when the United States had decided that they were going to engage in this war in Afghanistan, and some of the international partners were not on board with that, particularly the French. And there was this period of time when most restaurants in areas that had been significantly impacted by 9/11, so New York, DC, rural parts of America, you couldn't order French fries. You had to order freedom fries because we didn't want to even say the word French. The Justice Department also supported the creation of the American Protective League, which grew to 200,000 chapters nationwide, and cooperated with the Bureau of Investigations to spy on and turn in any suspected German spies, most of whom turned out to be German immigrants who were more recent immigrants to the United States, and they had not fully assimilated. So they still sounded German and they still kind of practiced German holidays. Efforts to restrict German cultural expression and limit American freedoms were a core component of the broader progressive trend toward social control. And in this moment, prohibitionists achieved victory. Arguments for conserving grain and controlling immoral behavior fueled the passage of the 18th Amendment, which banned the sale of alcoholic beverages. And not just the sale, but the consumption of and the production of. Remember, we've already embraced wheatless Mondays, and so now any grain that is grown in the United States can't be used for alcohol, because we want to make sure that we're promoting the war effort and we're really promoting moral behavior, which of course is not partaking in alcoholic consumption. Wilson's rhetoric for making the world safe for democracy appealed to many oppressed minorities living in the United States. Many African Americans served in the war, even though they remained segregated. Now, in January of 1918, Wilson presented Congress with his plan for peace of 14 points. And it was really a set of policies and principles designed to prevent future war. This war, called the Great War, was massive. It impacted so many parts of the world, and Wilson and other like-minded people really wanted to prevent this from ever happening again. And so he designs these 14 points, and the principles and policies outlined were intended to prevent future war, to promote trade, and to push for self-determination in the colonies in the different parts of the world. Now, the most significant piece of Wilson's proposal was the creation of what he called the League of Nations, which was a cooperative organization of nations that would arbitrate disputes and promote peace, using force only when all other alternatives had been tried. Wilson brought the 14 points to the Paris Peace Conference after the war ended. But he had difficulty winning the support of Allied leaders because these Allied leaders really believed that there needed to be retribution from Germany, that Germany needed to be punished financially and in the long term. Wilson abandoned significant components of the 14 points as part of a compromise to ensure the creation of the League of Nations. So Wilson comes to the Paris Peace Conference with this 14-point bullet list of things that he believes are absolutely essential to preventing any kind of war like this again. And most of the people at this conference say, well, we get what you're saying, but we need to really ensure that the nations that started this are truly held accountable. So Wilson ends up abandoning significant components of the 14 points as a compromise to ensure the creation of the League of Nations. And he really views this as the most significant measure for keeping communism in check. Now, Wilson agrees to a war guilt clause, which would put a lot of economic reparations on Germany for actually starting the war. In the end, Wilson won his fight and was able to establish the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles, which authorized the League to combat aggression against any member nation through collective military action. Now, Wilson has reached this agreement with the major world powers, and he is at this peace conference as the chief representative of the United States. After the 6-month battle in Paris for his 14 points, Wilson returns to the United States to battle the Senate over ratification. Remember, the president cannot unilaterally enter into any kind of treaty with another country. Congress is going to have to support this. Senate's going to have to sign off on that. In particular, there was a lot of opposition from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman named Henry Cabot Lodge. Now, Henry Cabot Lodge was a Republican, and Wilson was a Democrat, so there was certainly some political angst as well. Now, Lodge believed that Article 10 of the 14 points, which sanctioned collective security efforts against military aggression, threatened the United States' ability to conduct its own affairs. Lodge sort of argues that with this Article 10, the United States will be obligated to become involved in foreign skirmishes and issues, and he believes that the United States should only become involved if it's a direct concern for the United States. Now, his position was supported by 39 senators, which was enough to block the ratification. Now, in response, Wilson conceded that the treaty could be modified to allow the United States freedom to conduct its affairs in Latin America. But Lodge demanded further changes, which would completely undermine the significant portions of the mission of the League of Nations. Wilson and Lodge refused to compromise any further. And without any kind of compromise, this sort of is left unaddressed. Wilson attempts to rally the support of the public in the United States for this treaty by traveling across the United States by train, and he travels to the point of exhaustion. He is on this train tour And he's stopping in towns and he's shaking hands and he's listening to people's concerns and he's, hugging babies and he's doing all of those things that leaders are supposed to do. And he's begging the American people to write their senators and demand that their senators support the League of Nations and to vote against them if they do not. Now, while on the train tour, Wilson suffers a stroke, and the stroke that Wilson suffers really leaves him completely unable to do anything. For about 18 months, the last 18 months of his presidency, he is unable to govern. He is unable to make decisions. He is really withheld from the public, but the extent of his condition is also withheld from the public. His wife, Edith Wilson, really is the person who handles his affairs and makes a lot of decisions for him during this 18 months. Now, on November 19th, 1919, the amended treaty failed to pass the Senate, and the stalemate between Wilson and Lodge continued. Ratification again fails in 1920, and so the United States never actually joins the League of Nations, even though the United States was at least Wilson from the United States, was the person who actually developed and created the United Nations. And that brings us to the end of chapter 20.